What you know, Alibis. Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. We got finished with court early today, so I'm going to knock this episode out and get ready to go eat some good food later. Before we get started, you know the drill. Don't forget to hit subscribe, like the video, share it with your friends, and you can ring my bell if you want notifications of when I post new content. Just click on that little bell icon. Music fact of the day. The song Midnight Train to Georgia was originally called Midnight Plane to Houston. Songwriter Jim Weatherly got the idea after hearing his friend Lee Majors on the phone with his girlfriend Farrah Fawcett, who said she was taking the midnight plane to Houston to go visit her parents. Producers loved it and wanted to give the song to Sissy Houston, but asked Weatherly to change the location because of Houston's last name. All right, we're going to jump into today. It was a brief day as far as testimony goes. We started the day with Joseph Murray on cross. He's asked how many times he met with John Pryor, one time in person and once on the phone. The prosecution says the loss of Tammy was traumatic. Yes. Finding Tylee and JJ on the property was traumatic. Yes, for the whole family. Over the last 5 years, you've had many conversations with your spouse, Emma, and her siblings. He said he wouldn't say many conversations with the siblings, but they did have conversations. The state points out he did not see the attempted shooting on Tammy and didn't know until he read the Facebook post. Emma reached out to Tammy. Joe overheard Tammy and Emma talking. Emma was still on the call with Tammy when he called 911. The prosecution asked, did Chad call 911? No. The state says, you said you talked to Deputy Cannon. You went into the roadway and gave him details and denied. You told Deputy Cannon you heard Tammy scream. He says that's correct. They point out Deputy Cannon actually put that in his report. Is it wrong? Joseph Murray said it was wrong. They ask if it's possible whatever he relayed to Deputy Cannon was misunderstood. He said possibly, but it's unlikely. They ask if it's possible he could have been mistaken about Tammy's description about the paintball gun since you overheard a conversation. He said it was on speakerphone. I don't think so. They move on to the night before Tammy Daybell was pronounced dead, October 18th. You were helping a friend do work and needed to borrow the truck. You said it's my in-law's truck. In the grand jury, you said it was your mother-in-law's truck. You went to work to get the keys and you returned them and you gave them to Tammy. He said yes. The state points out that Chad gave him that truck in December of 2019. Yes, and he still has it. After Chad's arrest, you and Emma moved into Chad and Tammy's home. Yes. They pull up an exhibit from a checking account. June 9th, 2020, the same day the kids' bodies were found and the day Chad was arrested. They point out that there was an $8,000 deposit into his checking account. This came from Chad the day he was arrested. He says yes. They say Chad gave you the truck, gave Emma $9,000 in cash that day. So between the two of them, roughly $17,000, gave you a car and a place to live. He says yes. He asked, have you met Lori? Yes. The first time that he met Lori Vallow was the day after Tammy Daybell's funeral at Chad and Tammy's house. He said he never met Alex Cox. They talk about Detective Hermosillo being seen driving by the property. He said yes. And then he points out it was before and after Chad's arrest. He wasn't sure if he saw him the day JJ and Tylee were found. We know Detective Hermosillo was there and actively a part of digging up Tylee's remains. The state points out for law enforcement to drive back and forth, they could suspect the bodies were there. Joseph said this was after the bodies were taken out, and he still drives by. He seemed very bitter about this, and you can tell he is not a fan of law enforcement. The state says you wouldn't disagree that maybe he was doing surveillance, and the witness says, I don't see reasons for him returning. He did not make contact with Joseph when he drove by. They talk about the memorial fence that was set up, and you don't disagree that finding two kids is a traumatic experience. And the witness says, I don't understand why you would return during working hours to see a memorial fence. By the way, one comment that he made that drew an audible gasp from somebody in the courtroom, something about law enforcement, he doesn't do that job. And he said, essentially, that was the last job he would ever want to do. And it was said in kind of a disrespectful way. On redirect, Pryor brings up the checking account. And he said that Seth Daybell, how much did he get? $8,000. The witness says all children got $8,000 from Chad that day. The next witness, Kathy Raven, a forensic pathologist, she talks about the non-specific bruising to Tammy, which means there's no pattern to it. There's no anatomical cause of death at autopsy, and the toxicology done on Tammy was extensive. She said more than likely it was not a poisoning. The autopsy signature was sometime in January of 2021. He asked why the gap in time. She said toxicology can take months. And if you get the results back and it's negative, you may send off for more additional testing, and all that takes time. Her conclusion was no anatomical or toxicological cause of death. She said it would have been undetermined if it were up to her and not homicide. She said the bruising does not indicate a cause of death. Pryor asked her if someone were to sit on someone's chest to stop breathing, would it be difficult to do? She said it could be more than one person or about over 400 pounds. She said it would be difficult to kill someone that way. Also, there was no damage to the neck except from the embalming process. Again, she said she would have called this an undetermined death. She said seizures and cardiac arrhythmias can cause sudden deaths. They talk about Tammy's reported past medical issues that came from Chad, which was shaking. Is that consistent with a seizure? She said it's difficult to say. You would need a diagnosis from a neurologist for that. They talk about the different types of seizures. They can be big or small. And then Pryor asked if seizures can be fatal. She said yes. For arrhythmias, it's an electrical disturbance in the heart. You may not see anything at autopsy. Frequently, you see cardiac abnormalities. You don't have to have a structural defect, but one is usually there. The original medical examiner that testified said that you would be able to see it microscopically as well, if I remember correctly. She said there's no way to know the cause of death for Tammy because there was no scientific evidence for a cause of death. He asked about confirmation bias. If you have something in your mind, you can lean your diagnosis towards that. She said, as a pathologist, their decision should be based on science and not speculation. On cross. Totally owned it here. Do you work as a medical examiner? She doesn't currently, but she has. Who determines if an autopsy should be done? She said it varies. It's usually the pathologist in her jurisdiction. They point out the number of documents she looked at regarding Tammy's case. She reviewed the autopsy report, autopsy photos, toxicology reports, a brief report from the medical examiner in Utah, the typed coroner report, which did not have an author or any kind of a heading on it, Fremont County, Lieutenant Powell, another detective's notes, crime scene photos, and the Fremont County report from October 9th. She also looked at a report from Officer Mattingly and the coroner's interview. They asked if she's reviewed more since then, and she said it was 3 years ago and more things have come through. She said the defense was the one that provided her with everything. They go off on a list of very relevant things that you would think somebody would look at if they're being called as an expert witness, like Walmart records, an interview with Emily Daybell, Paul Daybell, Janet Penrose, David Warwick. Did you look at the Lollytime iCloud account? Nope. FBI analyst report? No. Seasons medical records? No. Teton medical records? No. This woman did not even look at Tammy Daybell's prior health history reports before coming to this determination. Did you look at the interviews with Matt and Regan Price? No. Ronald and Phyllis Douglas? No. All no. And they talk about the information from the seizure activity came from the coroner's report, which came from Chad Daybell. They point out, she said, possible cardiac arrhythmia, and you'd typically find a structural defect. Did Tammy Daybell have one? No. Pressure on the chest to cause asphyxia. You would expect it would be two people. The witness says it takes 450 pounds or more. Lindsay Blake points out, so you would agree. It could be more than one person? Yes. The witness talks about other ways you can asphyxiate: drowning, choking, suffocation, chemicals such as cyanide. Lindsay Blake says pillow over someone's head, object in front of their face. Witness says yes. Lindsay Blake right here nails it. One way would be a plastic bag over the head. Yes. And she points out, being in an autopsy, the patient can't tell you anything, right? No. On redirect, boy, did John Pryor put his foot in his mouth and make a Freudian slip, and we all were looking at each other. He says when a forensic pathologist is examining documents that aren't part of the scientific reports, is that confirmation bias? He says these are all interviews with people who weren't present at the murder. Yes, y'all. He said at the murder. We all We're speechless. The next witness, Regan Price, not sure why they called her. This poor girl had to come all the way up from Rexburg. They enter in a defense exhibit of an interview with her. She talked to law enforcement on May 5th of 2021. Her and her husband kept a journal of little things that they thought might be pertinent to the investigation. And on September the 9th, they thought maybe they heard a gunshot, but they weren't sure it was on the 9th. They talked to Rob Wood and looked at their phones to try and get the dates of when they might have heard that gunshot. It was close, but they didn't see anybody on Chad's property. Another neighbor also shot things frequently, so it wasn't uncommon to hear it. They were not around Chad and Tammy a lot. Her and her husband discussed strange things that happened with the Daybells, and they made a timeline so when they did talk to law enforcement, it would be resourceful. In a later interview, John Pryor points out she would work through Joseph Murray to try and get information by even wearing a wire. Her husband in the past had done work for Joe in his garden, and she's asked, did you engage in discussions talking about payment to work with the police regarding the Daybell case? She said it was more of a joke than anything on cross. At some point, you heard a gunshot in the early morning. She did, but again, doesn't remember the date. Could have been before September 9th, but it was not after. The state points out in the country, people have guns. She talked to Detective Kukamanu, obviously never accepted any kind of payment from law enforcement. The next witness, Hasmir Karadich. I hope I didn't butcher that name. He works for the Idaho Attorney General's office as an investigator. He was asked to participate in the investigation into Tammy's death on April 10th of 2020. Their investigation ended February of 2021. His chief asked him to stop because Fremont County wanted that case back. This revolved around Melanie Gibb. He interviewed her August the 5th of 2020. It was a very lengthy interview. The report was 182 pages. She said a lot of things he didn't understand as far as her beliefs go. And then it led to her explaining some of her personal beliefs, like light and dark. She hinted she was able to determine if someone was light or dark. She also talked about casting, using vibrations for healing, and she said she heard from Chad and Lori some of the things she was mentioning. He did have an off-tape discussion with her. It didn't record. So he contacted John Pryor and told him about these things Melanie Gibb had said. Melanie Gibb mentioned that the witness was nice and was a good person. He asked what she would rate him, and she said on the light side, so light he had a light aura. On cross, did she tell you she created this belief system? No. Did she say she met Chad through Lori and was a follower of some of their teachings? Yes. Chad would tell Lori these ideas and then Lori would tell Melanie Gibb? Yes. Many of these ideas came from Chad Daybell? Yes. Boom. That's it. The next witness, Rick Schmidt, retired from the Rexburg PD. He testified last year at Lori's trial and was asked about boundaries on the property like grids and his role in the search. Pryor asked, were you asked about boundaries and do you recall your response? And he said there were no boundaries. Pryor said, did they say, here's a shovel, go out there and find some stuff? And his response was yes, on cross. You were asked about the search warrant on June 9th of 2020. Where were you? He said Chad Daybell's property. You were asked about boundaries. Do you remember what that question was in regard to? He didn't, so they show a transcript. In the grid search, that was the reference. He was searching the fire pit and the pet cemetery. They asked, was there any type of grid or boundary? He said there were no specific boundaries in those areas. He didn't remember a grid being on the ground. He was handed a shovel and walked around. He doesn't remember where he went when he first got there. They asked, did you have a shovel? Yes. Were you told to go see if you could find evidence? Yes, by Steve Daniels, who was from the FBI. He was in charge of the scene. He has previously testified in this case, by the way. They were told before the search got going to just walk around and see if you see anything irregular in the earth, in the soil that stands out. Who were you with? He names off a couple of people. He said, we were told to walk the field and look for soft spots or areas that looked different. And that was it for the day. Not the best day for the defense. He does have some more witnesses that will begin first thing in the morning. I think he's very close to finishing up. Maybe tomorrow. We do have a long weekend coming up, so I'm not sure how they're going to do that, but I will be back at you tomorrow, letting you know everything that's happening in the courtroom. If you want to watch live on YouTube, I am adding things as I see them in chat. So we would love to have you come chit chat with us. I don't have the files for my intro and my outro. That's why you're not hearing the music Forgot to add that to my laptop, but it's all good. All right, guys, we'll see you soon. Have a good rest of your evening.